Is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Well, good morning, folks. Don't panic. This is Ken Kavula, and the class has not begun yet. But in mid-Michigan, we have a habit of starting early, and we call it chatting. So we have about 13 minutes where we can chat. If you have a question, a concern, if you'd like to make a comment, if you'd just like to test your equipment out and see if we have the possibility of talking to each other, now's a great time to raise your hand. You have an icon that you. Good morning, everybody. This is Ken Kavula from the Mid-Michigan chapter, and this is Getting Started 2025. We're going to offer 3 classes today. The first one is talking about the SSG Core tool from BetterInvesting. I'm joined by my good friend and great supporter and just general all-around nice guy, Mark Robertson. Mark is in the back room. He's going to be trying to answer questions as they occur, and he's going to be adding color commentary as we go through the class. He'll just jump in whenever he feels it's appropriate. We also have Herb Lemko from the Mid-Michigan chapter in the back room answering questions, and we have Marty Eckerly from the OKI, that stands for Ohio, Kentucky, Indiana chapter. That's down in the Cincinnati area, and Marty has just asked if he could help out this afternoon and evening, and of course he's going to be doing that. He's a great director, been a director for a long time down there in OKI. This is the Mighty Mac Bridge, and those are the Northern Lights if you're interested, and this is Getting Started 2025 Tools and Portfolios. We're sponsored by the Better Investing Mid-Michigan chapter and by Manifest Investing, and the CEO of Manifest Investing, Mr. Robertson, is in the back room giving us a hand today. Mark, by the way, is also a director with the Mid-Michigan chapter. We do have, oh, thank you, Herb. We do have a demonstration declaration. Everything we're going to do today is for illustrative purposes. We're not making any decisions about buying, selling, or holding a stock. And of course, all the SSGs that you're going to see are based basically on my judgments because I wrote all of these SSGs. That doesn't mean they're wrong, but that doesn't mean they're correct either. It just means they're my opinions on what the stocks may do. If you'd like a copy of the slides themselves, you can send an email to Mark R. at manifestinvesting.com, or you can send me an email at kkavula1@comcast.net. Either one of us will be glad to provide you with the slides, and we will be posting these 3 classes on YouTube. You can go to our YouTube channel by Googling or searching for Manifest Investing Roundtable or Mid-Michigan Roundtable or any combination of those words, and that'll take you right to our channel. If you get there and you're not a subscriber, please subscribe. That helps us a little bit, get some extra benefits from YouTube. And then everything that Mark and I do for the Mid-Michigan chapter is on that website. That means there's 14 or 15 years of material there, including the material from our bull sessions and from our Mid-Michigan roundtables. So if you're missing parts of it tonight or you'd like to go over it again, get the slides, or if you want the dialogue to go with it, go to YouTube and look at it again on YouTube. Our bios are right in the slides. I'm not going to read these to you, but Mark and I both have years and years and years of experience helping people become better investors. Mark traces his better investing roots back to the Chicago chapter, where he was an officer in the chapter and where he was in an investment club for many years. And my roots have always been in Mid-Michigan. From the time we were just a small chapter in the Saginaw Bay City, Midland, Flint area, to today where we cover the entire state except for the Detroit metro area. We're glad to help our clubs. We visit clubs all over the state and all over the country. Mark and I will be in North Carolina in the Greensboro area next weekend, speaking to a group of investors down there. And if you're anywhere near that particular location, go to the North Carolina chapter webpage on BetterInvesting, and you can sign up and come see us and listen to us give our song and dance show about investing. Mark likes to include a disclosure about manifest investing. And of course, you have time to read this at your leisure, but manifest is something that we think really complements the better investing tools and help us become even better investors than we already are. So here's our class today. We're going to go through the SSG Core tool. I've always felt as a professional educator that trying to tell everybody everything you know about something in a short period of time is essentially wasted teaching time. I'd like to go through and hit the high points and then go through again and maybe give you a little bit more detail, and then offer opportunity for you to practice and ask questions. So as I said in our chat session, we will be setting up some help sessions in the next 2 or 3 or 4 weeks, probably on Saturday mornings or early afternoons, where we'll just open mic for our audience today. We know your email addresses, so we'll send you an email blast and give you the opportunity to ask questions if you feel that you have some questions about the core or the plus or about portfolios. Today, we're going to look at the beginning, at least, on an SSG using the core tool. And the stock we're going to start with is Alphabet, and we're going to use the stock ticker for Alphabet, GOOG. Here's the first slide on the core. And if you're in the tool as a beginner and you don't see a slide with a single line on it like you're seeing here, then it might be because you've bought both tools and you're not in the core or the beginner's tool. Go to the very top of the page and look where it says switch tools. It's almost in the center. And right now you can see that Core SSG on my page has a green background, which means that's the active program I'm looking at. If you're looking at your tools and you don't see just a single line on the first page of the tool, then you might be in SSG plus. So click the core and you should match what you're seeing on my page. Now, I've put GOOG in here, and just because it's a presentation, I've filled some numbers in as well. But we're going to talk about some things that you need to do before you start to use the tool. Even before you look at the graph or the numbers, I want you to focus on the organization of the tool, and that would be in the tabs that are to the very top of the screen. One of the tabs goes all the way from the left to the right, and the other has a couple of steps attached to it. Notice that there are a few tabs. We're on the first one called Analyze Growth. And beneath that tab, there seem to be 3 steps, and we've highlighted step 1, which is the historical sales. Off to the right of the graph, you'll also see a block called education. Notice that education has a slider bar to the right of the dialogue, excuse me, And the slider bar means that there's a lot of material that if you're not quite sure what you're supposed to do on this slide, you can read as much or as little of that box until you get the idea of what it is that you're supposed to do on tab 1, step 1. There'll be an education block attached to every step on every tab in this entire Core SSG tool. So if you're a beginner, make use when you get lost. Read what the particular step is asking you to do, what it's all about, and look at the graph as you read or the chart as you read, and you'll get a really good idea of where the tool is trying to direct you. Now, as a true beginner, I'm not going to ask you to go out and find a half dozen sources for your judgments. An SSG is basically just an organized way of presenting your ideas and coming up with a return forecast, an idea of what the stock might return if you were to hold it for the next 5 years. We're going to look at just 2 sources today, and as a beginner, I would kind of urge you not to get overloaded with information when you do your first half dozen or dozen SSGs. Kind of keep your information relatively narrow and keep it to some trusted sources. Our first trusted source is Value Line. You can get Value Line for free at many, many libraries. And if your local library doesn't have Value Line, then you might want to contact, and I would do it electronically, contact the library in the largest city near where you are. Many times the larger cities have consortiums where you can either pay a very small fee or just register with them and then have access to their entire electronic library. I got this one through the Genesee Regional Library. Genesee is the name of my county, and I highlighted the Value Line page for Alphabet. Now, first of all, make sure you have the most current Value Line page that exists. Look down in the bottom right-hand corner, and if the date down there is more than 3 months old, then you don't have the most current Value Line. Make sure you get the most current. The report looks extremely daunting. It's very challenging for a novice to look at all of this data and try to make sense out of it. So we're going to focus only on a few places on the Value Line report.
Ken, I do have
Go on, Mark. Yes.
just a quick tip for the audience, especially if you're a beginner and you like free things. You can go to valueline.com and actually get access to the 30 companies that are in the Dow Jones Industrial Average. That would include Alphabet. And you can actually access these reports. So again, if you're a beginner and you want to skim some of these reports, in the chat box, I have put the link to the Value Line 30. So you can do that for free. And again, if you're a beginner and just trying to figure out what does this information look like for a variety of companies, you have the opportunity to do some skimming, and it's an awareness moment. So it's in the chat box.
Thank you, Mark. That's a great tip, folks. The Value Line 30 you can get directly from Value Line, and it doesn't cost you a penny. Our second source is Manifest Investing. It is a low-cost website, a very, very reasonably priced website, and we like to use it because it gives us information that's not available from a lot of other sources, and the information comes from a source that we don't normally have access to. It comes from Y-Charts data, and that's a name that's not even familiar to most folks in the retail investing world because it's a source used by professional investors. Y-Source is just data like CFRA data, that's the old S&P, like value line data, like Morningstar data, like FactSet data. Y-Charts is another data source, and we get it with Manifest right here, and we get some ways that we can validate our SSGs with a different number source, and that helps us know how accurate we're actually being on our stock selection guides. So let's get started on Alphabet. GOOG is the ticker. And on this first tab, first step, you don't have anything to do except look at it and think. That's right, you don't have anything to do except to think. We'd like to see a line for the historical sales that is reasonably straight, that is moving in an upward direction. And if we have a line like that, that is indicating to us that we have a company that is growing in a reasonably consistent manner. Now, if you're really kind of watching carefully, you'll notice that the graph paper has different spaces between the horizontal lines. It's not typical graph paper. This is a special kind of graph paper, and if you use it, and by the way, the computer does all of this work, don't panic, but if you use this special kind of graph paper, then consistent growth will graph as a straight line rather than as a curved line like it would do on normal graph paper. Notice that we're in, again, step 1 on tab 1, and we're going to step through these 3 steps, and then we're going to step through the tabs to finish the core. So far, everything that we're looking at makes sense, and it looks like we have a good, solid, consistent, growing company. I can even see how fast that company has been growing for the last 10 years by looking at the data bars. In that first set of data, I see a 19.3 way off to the right of the data, and that indicates that year over year, the growth of that straight line that underlies the data, we'll call that the trend line, a growth of that straight line has been growing at 19% plus, and it's been doing it for 10 years. That's exceptional growth for a huge $350 billion company. I also can look at the data in the very bottom of the slide and see how the company has done in the last quarter. And in the very last quarter, that's the last 3 months that it reported, I can see that Alphabet, and this is the quarter that ended in December, I can see Alphabet was growing by just under 12% in sales. That's slower than the 10-year average, but it's still exceptional for a large company.
Ken, this is Herb.
Go on, Herb.
Yeah, if you could use your cursor to point to some of those things, it might be helpful for people to know where you're looking.
I'd be glad to do that. Thanks for the tip, Herb. Appreciate it. Let's move to step 2. We're now looking at earnings per share. Again, we'd like consistent growth in earnings per share. And I see a couple of aberrations in this slide. Back in 2017, I see that earnings took a drop and then rebounded in 2018. That was due to the new tax law that went into effect back in 2017, where a lot of companies had to make a one-time payment out of their earnings in order to repatriate some money to the US. I also see a bump in 2021, and that was where the earnings shot up and then went back to trend again in 2022. You can see it bumping up and going back to trend. This was due to a lot of folks staying at home, using Google services, and bumping up the earnings during the pandemic. Again, a one-time effect before the company went back to trend. So if I kind of ignore those two aberrations, I get a nice, consistent, up and straight, relatively straight line. And I also have a trend line, this straight line that's been laid underneath the data. And I can see that those, for the last 10 years, the earnings have been growing at about 26.5%. I can also see in the most recent quarter, they were doing even better than that number at over 30%. Again, exceptional numbers for a very large company. So far, nothing not to like. Let's move to step 3. We now have the sales line, and in our tools, a sales line will always be green. And we have an earnings per share line. And again, in our tools, the earnings line will always be blue. And now I see these little black bars on the graph. Those bars are sometimes called I bars because they look like the capital letter I, but we like to call them price bars. And it's telling us the high and the low price during each of the corresponding fiscal years. The longer the I bar, the more volatile the price was, the more the price varied during that year. You can also see that in the most current 52 weeks, we have a current price, and it's denoted by that red tick. And the current price is somewhere in the upper half of the 52-week range. Alphabet's been a pretty decent stock to own for quite a large amount of time. What do we want to see? Well, we'd like to see those lines moving up and straight, and we'd also like the trend lines to be reasonably parallel to each other. And then we'd like to ask you to kind of squint at the I bars and ask yourself whether those I bars have been moving up kind of parallel to a line that is parallel to the trend lines for sales and earnings. Again, we're getting data down at the bottom, and we've seen the data in the bottom set of numbers, but we're also seeing the high-low values from the I bars, and you can see the prices high and low during different fiscal years. You might want to jot down that historical growth. The sales were at 19.3, the earnings at 26.4. Now we're going to move to step 1, tab 2. We've clicked here, and now we're going to go to the first step in evaluate management. If you're not sure what you're looking at, then look over to the right in education. We're looking at percent pre-tax profit. We also see the name called out in the data at the bottom of the screen. And if you're not sure what pre-tax profit is, then now's a great time for you to read the education block. Don't forget, there's a slider bar here, which means there's quite a bit of information available. Read as much or as little as you need to. What are we looking for? Well, stability for a very large company is a great thing, but if we can see increasing profits, that's even better. And we can see that since the pandemic, when profits were roughly in line with the pre-pandemic profits, we can see that they've really increased their profit in the 2 fiscal years after the pandemic. Those are all really good things. And we even get a call out for the last 5 years average number, and it's been around 30%. Just ask yourself, is that good or is that bad? If you can't decide, it's because it's very difficult to compare profit to itself. You need to compare profit to a peer group. And we'll get to that in a later class. Let me just tell you right now that Alphabet's profits are really kind of exceptional for the peer group that it happens to be in.
Yeah, Ken, I have a comment on that last slide, just so everybody's aware. If you want to back up just one, just real quickly, notice the scale on the left, and it can be potentially a tiny bit misleading. That starts at 22 and goes up to 36. It's not starting at 0. So what looks like a fair amount of volatility in this, if you really put it in context, you're only talking about a couple percent up, or it's not as big as the chart might make it seem. So be aware of the scale, the y-axis scale, anytime you look at a chart on a tool like this, because it's automatically, and it's doing a good thing. I'm not being critical, but just be aware that that's not as big as it looks if you put it in context.
Another excellent point, Mark. Many times I've looked at a graph and said to myself, what happened? And then I've looked at the scale and said, nothing. Okay, so Mark's right. Be very careful with the scale, because these graphs scale automatically depending on the data that's available to them.
But that is a nice picture of a COVID camel, by the way.
Yes, it is. Here we are on evaluating management, and we've moved to step 2. And again, this is a quantity that if you're not familiar with it, you might want to read the education that goes with it, okay? Here's the data, the actual numbers, and here's the graph of those numbers. Again, a fairly tight scale for the numbers, but in this graph, I actually see a trend going on. I think generally the graph is moving in an upward direction, and that's something that I really like to see. Return on equity is something that we check, and we can actually come up with a rule of thumb for return on equity. We can tell ourselves that if it's in the mid-teens to upper teens, that's really good and solid. And if it hits around 20, 21, 22, that's excellent. And it moves above those numbers, and it's superb. That's a number that means, it's a word that means nothing better. And this 31% in the most recent fiscal year down here, that's a superb return on equity for a large company or for any company that we might be looking at. Again, real positive stuff about this company. Now, if you notice, I've skipped step 3 and I've moved directly to step 4. Step 3 is information that's all true, but it's not very helpful to interpret. On step 4, however, we're given percentage of debt as it applies to the total amount of equity in the stock that we're looking at. We'd like to see a number at around 33% or less. Now, be aware that there are certain industries where none of the companies hit that particular rule of thumb. But in general, if the debt falls beneath 33%, then that's debt that the company can handle without having a lot of other problems associated with it. Here, I'm looking at Alphabet's debt. Again, remember to check the scale. And I'm looking at the debt for the most recent 3 or 4 years. And I'm telling myself the debt is very small compared to everything that the company exists on, to all of its equity. And therefore, debt is probably not going to cause this company any particular problems if we should have a bad economy forced on us, or if something really negative should happen like a pandemic. The company should be able to get through those kind of activities without a lot of problem because of the low debt. This is one time when a negative number, that means the debt is going down, is really good. Here we are
Ken,
now
Ken,
on.
another quick comment, because
Sure, go on,
I
Mark.
get this question a lot. Why? The question is why the 33% or 50%? Why is the rule of thumb even there? And again, if you're relatively new to investing, the reason is because if the company gets into jeopardy or in danger of bankruptcy or whatever, the shareholders are always the first ones to suffer. The debt people that actually loan money to the company have priority. So when the National Association was formed, almost 80 years ago, for somebody that's relatively new to investing, if you avoid companies with debt, you actually are removing some of the potential risk. So until you understand, relative debt and that kind of stuff, that's the reason for this guideline. For a beginner, yeah, 33% could be a lot compared to the other companies in the industry, but keep in mind that it's hard to go bankrupt if you have no debt. It can be done, but it's hard. So that's why the rule exists.
Thanks, Mark. Here we go now to tab 3, and we're back to step 1 again. This is the first time we're actually going to enter a number. You've gone through 2 of the 5 tabs, and you haven't even had to do any typing yet in the core. Now they're going to ask us for a judgment, okay? We need to make a call on what we think sales for this company will grow at annually for the next 5 years. Now, we already have some data. We got a number for the last 10 years, a historical number at more than 19%. Our data is also giving us a 2-year number, 2 years into the future, coming from Morningstar. All of our data is provided by Morningstar in this tool, and Morningstar is suggesting that for the next 2 years, sales might grow at 10% a year. So that's some data that we might be collecting. We're going to ask you to collect just a little bit more data. Remember that value line sheet we talked about? I don't want you to try to understand all the numbers and all the boxes on the sheet, but I do want you to focus on a box on the left-hand side of the sheet, down about 3/4 of the sheet. I've circled it, and then I've blown it up, and it's called the annual rates box. It's telling us what Value Line's idea of sales growth, and they don't use the word sales, they use the word revenue. That's a synonym. They're telling us that in the next 3 to 5 years, yeah, it's a little squishy on the timeline, but in the next 3 to 5 years, they're suggesting that Alphabet sales might grow at 15.5%. That's something that we want to capture, a piece of data. Eventually, we'd like to get maybe 6 or 8 or 10 different calls on sales growth that are long term. But for the moment, we're going to settle for just a couple. Alphabet, from Value Line's point of view, might grow 15.5% somewhere in the 3 to 5 year time range. Here's the manifest sheet for Value Line. Remember, the data is coming from a different source, which means it's a different opinion. We don't expect the opinions to all coincide with each other. In fact, I'd be suspicious if they were all the same. Y-Charts is suggesting that Alphabet, Google we sometimes call it, might have sales growth for the next 5 years at around 12.5%. So I'll put that number down and capture it as well. Now, this is a daunting task, your first number, but you have to be bold and assertive. You have a range of suggestions, folks, and all you're trying to do is come up with a reasonable value based on that range of suggestions. I chose 14% after thinking about all those numbers that I just talked about. Is my number the right answer? No, but it's a good, reasonable answer. Would I argue with you if you came in at 13 or maybe even 15? I don't think so. But I think you'd have a firm discussion in place if you were to come in at 18 or 5. All you're trying to do is be reasonable, and your choices of values can differ and still be reasonable. So let's fill in that 14 and move on. Now, the next step we have is going to be to forecast earnings. Now we want to estimate the growth in earnings for the next 5 years. And remember the historic value, it's called out right down here, exceeded 25%. We also have an earnings call from our Morningstar data, and the Morningstar data is giving us a 5-year call on earnings at almost 16%. Remember that value line sheet? Well, they also give us an earnings number, and they're calling out 13.5% for the next 3 to 5 years. There's no percentage number coming from Manifest, so we won't look for one at this moment. Again, we're trying to be reasonable. Look at the range of numbers that we had. Everything from 13.5 in value line up to 26.4 in the 10-year historical number. I chose 12. Again, it's not necessarily the correct answer, but I think it's reasonable, and I think it's reasonable on the conservative side. I think if I were to move to 6, however, we'd have a great discussion about how that number is probably unreasonable. And if I were to mimic the 26% historical number, I think I would point out how difficult it is for a huge company to keep growing at earnings anywhere past 15%, let alone 26%. I think my number is reasonable, but I think that there are many other great answers as well. Go on, Herb.
Yeah, I got a question that says, what rationale do you put for the projected sales estimate? Do you take an average? Is there a best way to come to this projection?
I would like you to view projections as more of an art than a science. I have a mathematics and a science background, and I know when I began learning about the SSG, my instincts were to be, there has to be one best answer, and it must be lying in the numbers. And I've learned over time that I need to trust my emotions and my judgment and what's going on outside of the company itself. I don't want to give you a formula. I want you to look at the numbers that you've collected and come up with a value that you feel is reasonable and that you feel you could support. You know, I think I could support a number all the way as high as 14 or even 14 and a half. I think I have enough data to support that, but I also think that I have enough data to support my 12. I think both of those numbers are reasonable, and I think I'm going to have the opportunity to validate my judgments as I move along in the stock selection guide using this core tool. Don't forget every time you type in a number to hit update study, because until you hit update study right here at the bottom of this particular step, the computer will not know that you've chosen a value for this particular judgment. Well, I'm on tab 4 now. And again, there's 4 steps in tab 4. We're going to now look at some historical PE values. I already know that there was some strange things going on during the pandemic. So I'm already looking at 2017's pandemic value, and I'm saying to myself, I'm sorry, I misspoke here. I already know there were some odd things going on with the tax structure in 2017. So I'm looking at the 2017 value and I'm kind of ignoring it. I also know there were some odd things going on during the pandemic. That's the 2022 number. And again, I'm going to kind of ignore it as I look at this graph. I could even hit those numbers right here and remove them entirely from consideration. Well, kind of ignoring those 2 numbers, I drew a heavy black line on the graph. That was not there when I opened up this tab and this step. I drew that line at a place around where I think that the PEs might be headed. The last 5-year average high PE was 28.4. I think that going forward, 28 is a reasonable number, although I think I could probably support 27 or 26, maybe even 25 or 29. And I can certainly support all of those whole numbers with a decimal attached. Most of the time, I hardly ever use a decimal on my PE values because I'm not being that precise when I do my reasoning. Again, I don't think that 28.4 is any more or less reasonable as an average for the next 5 years as my number of 28. And again, I think if you were to choose 27 or even 26, you could probably support it with the data that's being shown. So again, I'm going to fill that into the blank box. Don't forget to update the data because the computer needs to know you filled in a number. And look what happens when you put the 28 into the box. It generates a future high price based on your judgment. I'm not going to go into it, but I'm going to tell you that whenever you multiply any PE by a corresponding earnings per share number, you'll get a price at that time. And here's a possible high price 5 years from now. Mark, were you going to interject?
Nope.
Oh, I thought I heard you. Okay, let's keep going. Here I am in step 2. Now I'm looking at the low PEs. And again, I'm kind of ignoring 2017 and 2022. Again, I'm taking a black line. I added that line. That was not there. And I'm drawing it through a number that I think might be reasonable. Since all of the values are clustered, especially the more recent values, are clustered around that black line that I drew, that's close to the 5-year average, which is 16.4. I'm going to use 16. Is it the correct number? Well, I don't think there is a correct number. I think there are only reasonable numbers. Could I support a 15 or a 17 or even a 14? I probably could find a good argument for any of those values. Would any of you choose 22 or 5? I would hope not, because I would hope you would see that that's a very unreasonable number to choose for the 5-year average for the low PE going forward. Again, there I am filling in that 16. This $8.05 comes from the last 4 quarters earnings. And that should be, if this is truly a growth company, that should be the lowest possible earnings for the next 5 years. The current trailing 12 months, TTM, value of 805 should set a floor for the lowest price in the next 5 years. And again, a PE value times a corresponding earnings value should give you a corresponding price. And there I am setting a low price 5 years from now of around 129 dollars. Notice that we have 3 choices in the core tool. And as a beginner for your first 5 or 10 SSGs, I would urge you to stick with choice 1. Even today, as experienced as I am, I'm using choice 1 90 or 95% of the time when I do an SSG. I love to press the button directly below. I'm going to back up just a second. There's a button directly below this data right here. Don't forget to update the study. And the button opens up this picture. Notice that the bar graph, and this is on step 3 of tab 3. Notice that this picture is divided into actually 4 pieces. The top quarter says sell, the bottom quarter says buy, and the middle 2 quarters say hold. Notice the price at the time I did the study was right in that buy zone, in that green range, but it was very close to the hold zone, a few dollars, and it would have moved into the hold zone. If you think your SSG is reasonable, then this conclusion of buy might be something you'd want to consider. Now, there are a lot more considerations than just the SSG saying buy. You have to look at a lot of things in your portfolio, and we'll be talking about that in class 3. But for now, I'm getting an indication that this is a buy. And think about it, folks. We have not had any real red flags raised about this company at all from the data that we've had available. Here I am moving to the 4th step in the 4th tab, and they've added a second bar graph. And the second bar graph talks about risk versus reward, upside to downside. And we'd like to have 3 times the reward in dollars for every dollar that we put at risk. And you can see that if a stock is in the buy zone, then it also has an upside downside greater than 3 to 1. This upside downside is 3.6 to 1, to less than 1. And we're pretty sure that we're getting enough potential reward for the risk that we're taking. One more tab to go. Let's move there. Tab 5, step. Oh, there's only a single step. This talks about dividend if the company pays a dividend. And for Alphabet, it's making it easy on us to make a decision. Alphabet never paid a dividend through 2022. And in 2024, it started paying a dividend. It paid 7.5% of its earnings directly to the shareholders with a dividend check. So every share got a small piece of that 7.5% pie, and they were able to cash that check and use that cash in any way they felt was good. Well, we don't have a lot of other data to look at, so let's assume that the board of directors is going to keep that payout at about 7.5% of the earnings. That's the default value that falls into the tool, and you just don't want to change it. You do have to update the study, however, to make sure the computer knows you're going to accept the default. Here's the reason we do the SSG. We want to know the potential return 5 years in the future. Now, it's important that you understand that you're looking at the best case scenario. You're going to sell this stock in 5 years at the high PE that you called for. I think we used a 32. And if you're able to do that 5 years from now, and if the growth rate stays where we predicted for earnings, then you stand to make, including the dividend, about 16.5%. About 3 or 4/10 of the total return is coming from dividend. So you can see that that's an awfully small amount. Most of the return is coming from price appreciation. The stock has the potential to return about 16 or 17% on an annual basis for the next 5 years, and that's certainly a great number for a huge company.
Ken, I think it's important to note that that doubles your money in 5 years.
It is, but we're not there yet, Herb, okay? We'll now go live to the Core SSG, and we're going to spend about 10 minutes walking through that core a second time, only this time we're going to look at Zoetis. So give me a chance to get through to the core. Here we are. And here I am. I know I'm in the core because that has a green background. And I'm back on step 1 of tab 1. Tab 1, step 1. This time my company is Zoetis, ZTS, and these folks offer supplies and materials to veterinarians. It's kind of exciting right at the moment because they have a bird flu vaccine that seems to be working, and a bird flu vaccine that could even be used domestically would probably drive the price of eggs back down to something that we'd be more likely to want to buy. Again, All I'm doing in this first step is looking. Is the graph moving upward, and is it reasonably straight? And how fast is it moving upward? Well, it's measured for me at about 8% a year for the last 10 years. In the recent quarter, it grew about 5%. Much slower growth than we were seeing from Google. Let's move. And now, since I'm live, I'm going to actually use my cursor and move to step 2. There's the earnings. You know, I see that these earnings are growing nice and consistently, nice and straight line, moving upward, but that number is quite different than these earnings. So I'm going to remove those earnings to get a better read on what's going on. And all I'm doing is clicking on those numbers. And now the trend line lies on the data from this is 18 all the way up to 2024. And I can see that that growth in sales was about 12%. In the most recent quarter, the growth has even been better than that at about 13%. Those are good values for me to think about as I move forward. No red flags yet. Let's look at both of those lines and let's look at the price bars. Are the lines roughly up? Yes. Are they kind of straight? Yes. Are they kind of parallel to each other? Yes. This is a classic better investing kind of growth stock. Up, straight, and parallel. But here's a great example of where the price might have gotten way in front of the growth. Because if I imagine a line going through the tops of these I bars right here, I can see that it would be much steeper than either the sales growth or the earnings growth. And I can see that Zoetis has come back to reality, because if I were to connect this lowest I bar with this most recent I bar, I'd have a line that was much more parallel to these two. This is probably a reasonable area for this company to trade in as the sales and earnings continue to grow. I do get some numbers. I've seen these numbers before, and I do get the data for the high-low price. Notice that I had some volatility going on in the pandemic and immediately after the pandemic. The pandemic probably began in 2020 here. So I have some volatility going on when people decided that pets were going to be a good thing if you were going to be in the house for a long period of time. We've seen recently shelters and veterinarians report that a lot of pets are being left at shelters and not being kept with the owners that had them during those pandemic years. Let's keep moving to tab 2, step 1. Pre-tax profit. And again, I might want to knock off this first couple years to get pre-tax profit that's a little bit more trendy for me, that I can read a little bit better. And again, watch the scale, because this is not a huge scale, although it kind of looks like it might be. I'm getting pre-tax profit in the 32% range, and I can tell you for an internet retailer, that's probably pretty decent profit going on right there. How about return on equity? I'm looking at numbers that are really in excess of that 22 or 23 that I said was superb. And I'm looking at good stability in those numbers, especially in the most recent fiscal years. How about, remember, I'm going to skip step 3 in this tab and go directly to step 4. Boy, here's one time where I like to see a line moving downward, and that means that they're reducing their debt. Look, back in 2015, their debt to capital was at 82%. And now we're down to a number that's 58%. This is still kind of high, but they're doing a reasonable job, I think, of reducing debt. This is maybe a pink flag and something we should be aware of. We'll learn later to find out how serious this debt problem is, but for now, just tell yourself it's kind of a pink flag going forward. Here we are on tab 3, step 1, and now we have to forecast sales. We've read that sales line historically at 8%. We've looked at a value line, or in fact, we're going to look at a value line. And that value line number, remember, I'm going to just focus on this annual rate box, and sales from value line's point of view might be 6.5% going forward. We're also going to look at manifest investing. For Zoetis. And we're noticing that they're indicating sales might grow at 6.4%. So what I need to do, and let me get back to our tool here now. What I need to do is come up with a value that I feel is reasonable. Well, you know, it's not unrare, but it's not exceedingly common when manifest and value line almost agree with each other. So I'm going to think that that's a pretty firm value, and I'm going to use the 6% that I saw from both of those trusted sources. So I filled it in, and now I want to update the study. Once I've updated the study, I'm going to go to the next tab. Look at the earnings value here. I'm getting a little bit of help from the tool. They're telling me that the earnings for the next 5 years might grow at 9.5%. The historical number has been 11.8%. And let's go back to that to that value line number. Here's the annual rates box. I'll make it bigger for you. And you can see that we're getting a 7.5% call for earnings growth for the company. I don't have a percentage number for manifest, so I need to go back. Here we are. So I'm going to try to use something that I think is reasonable. 12 historically. I'm thinking about that value line number, and I'm going to use 8. I don't think that's the correct answer, but I think that's a reasonable answer to use going forward. Again, you'd want to hit update study to make sure that you had the right number going on. Let's go to tab 3. Remember, I'm trying now to set a PE value that I feel is reasonable going forward. Okay, I'm going to show you one more thing on the value line sheet, and I've gone back to the value line sheet, and I've gone up into the grid now, and I'm pointing out that Value Line makes a call on the average annual PE ratio, and they call out 32. 3 to 5 years from now, they think that 32 might be a reasonable average PE. Let's look at Manifest really quickly before we go back to the tool, because Manifest also makes a call on PE ratio, and Manifest thinks that the average PE ratio for Zoetis might be 27. Do you see the 27 right there? So there's a difference of opinion between the data sources. Let's go back to the SSG. I have to make a call on the high side. Over history, it's been 48. Most recently, it's been around 37 and around 40. Going forward, I'm going to say that the high, because I see these numbers trending downward from around 50, I'm going to suggest that 32 might be reasonable. Now, that might seem to come out of nowhere for a lot of you. Some of you might have wanted to use the 48. I think that's unreasonable compared to the most recent high PE numbers. Some of you might have wanted to use 36 or 37. You might be able to make a case for a PE that high, but my two trusted sources are telling me that the averages are going to be a lot lower than that. I've used the average that Value Line says as the high number. Again, I don't think it's right or wrong, but I do think that it's reasonable. Let's go to next step. I'm trying to set a low PE number. I'm looking at these low values right in here. I'm looking at, I think they're falling around 26, 27, somewhere in that range right there. And I've chosen 27 as the low. Now let's stop for a moment. I chose 32 as the high, 27 as the low. If I add those together, that's 59, let's say 60. And the average of those two numbers would be 29 and a half, let's say 30. I'm saying that my average will be around 30. And you know, that's kind of right in between where Manifest thinks the 5-year average will be and where Value Line thinks the 5-year average will be. I think my values are very reasonable. Let's go to step 3. Using my judgments, I'm getting another buy. Current price within the prices that were set in the buy zone. And because it's in the buy zone, it also has an upside downside greater than 3 to 1. In this case, 4.6 to 1. Let's go to the last tab. Here's Zoetis, and here's the payout ratio for the last 5 years for Zoetis. Remember, Google was only paying 7.5% of its earnings directly to its shareholders. Zoetis, in the most recent fiscal year, was paying almost a third of its earnings directly to the shareholders, and the 5-year average was about 27%. That's the default, but you're allowed to alter that default. It appears to me that the board of directors is raising the payout ratio and has been doing that since about 2018. And I've decided to use 35 as the payout ratio going forward. Would I argue with you if you use the default of 27.4? Absolutely not. How about if you chose 32? I think it's reasonable. How about if you chose 50? I think it's probably unreasonable as choosing maybe 20. Again, update the study and let's look at where we are in our potential. I've scrolled down now and I'm looking at the potential annualized price appreciation of around 9%. And I'm looking at a yield of around 1%. That means like interest on the account, interest on the stocks you own, about 1% of the stock price values. The current yield, because the price is a little bit lower than it might be in the future, current yield 1.2, annualized rate of return based on these judgments, about 10%. If you're confused by the arithmetic, then trust the machine at this point. Don't try to do the arithmetic yourself in the beginning. Assume that the machine is doing the arithmetic based on your judgments and assume that it's correct. That's pretty decent return for a mid-sized company like Zoetis, and you might want to put it into your portfolio as well. Let's move back to our slideshow right now.
And Ken, you do have about 5 minutes. It's 10 after.
Okay. And we're looking at Zoetis. We just did an SSG on it. We walked through the SSG Plus. Our next class will be now transitioning from this core tool to the SSG Plus. But you heard Mark, we have about 5 minutes now to answer questions. And don't panic, folks. I'm willing to go even 10 minutes into the future to answer questions. So Mark, do we have any questions back there?
I think we've stayed pretty well ahead of them. Good stuff all around. I would just make an editorial comment because I know we have a blend of investors in the audience. It's interesting that the vaccine news for Zoetis hasn't really seemed to have affected the analyst estimates for the company yet. So we might be ahead of this one. It's a good study. And I'm pretty sure it's the current stock to study in Better Investing magazine. Is that correct?
It's one of the stocks to
One of the
study. I
stocks.
don't know if it's actually the current, but it is in Better Investing magazine this month. And that's a coincidence, by the way. I started writing this class 6 weeks ago, and I didn't have my BI magazine at that point.
You just wanted
But
an
we're
A and a
awfully
Z.
happy. We're awfully happy that that we came up with an A stock and a Z stock, right? He sold my closing line, so
Oh, I didn't mean to.
we're
Sorry.
all set. That's
I take
okay.
I will retract my statement.
So, are there any
Yeah.
other questions that we should answer? Herb, did you find a question?
Yeah, no question, but just to let you know that there are two Googles. There's Google L and Google, and so you pick the one Google. So people in the audience don't get confused. They're basically somewhat the same, but they're two different stocks.
Right, and they trade almost identically to each other. One of them includes voting rights as a shareholder, the other doesn't. And I'll tell you frankly, I would buy the cheaper. If you're going to buy Google, buy the cheaper of the two, and don't worry about voting rights. Your 100 or 200 or even 10,000 shares aren't going to make much difference in voting about this particular company.
Did I see a hand in the air someplace?
We do have a hand in the air, and
I missed it.
That's coming from Precious. And Precious, I'm going to unmute you. You're muted on your side, Precious, so you'll have to unmute yourself. And if you can do that, then you can talk directly to us.
She's going to get me fired. I was watching so carefully.
We can hear you now. We can hear you. Go ahead and ask your question.
Okay. I was wondering, for a new investment group, because we have a new chapter here in Maryland, our new investment group under the Maryland chapter. Is it best to look at the stocks that are listed in Better Investment? That for us to choose a stock to study, or should we be looking for stock, just looking for any individual stock that might interest us?
It's
Good
it's
question.
a really great question, Precious. And the first thing I would do is ask, are you using the Core or the SSG Plus? Either one.
I feel like our officers all purchased the top level, which I think is what, the SSG Plus.
Right. But if you purchase the SSG Plus, let your officers know they also have the Core available then, okay? And what I
Okay.
would do is I would look at stocks that you're interested in, but I would stick to tab 1 and just look at sales and earnings. And if they're not straight lines for sales and for earnings moving in an upward direction, then I would move on to another choice. There's plenty of good, solid, up straight and parallel growth companies for beginners to look at. And I've given you 2 examples of what you are looking for in a stock. Now, they won't all be in the buy zone, but as you are a beginner, it's important that you complete SSGs even for stocks that aren't in the buy zone, and then save those SSGs and come back to them periodically as you update data and update prices. You might find a month from now or 2 months from now that stock that was out of reach today might be in the buy zone 2 months from now. So again, there's nothing wrong with the stocks that Better Investing looks at. I absolutely take a look at them, but don't be afraid to go through your own lists looking for good, solid growth stocks, at least in the beginning, until you get used to the tools and until you get used to dealing with stocks that aren't as well behaved as these 2 that I talked about today. Does that help a little bit?
It helps a whole lot.
Let me also make the comment that you're lucky to be sitting in a geographic area where you have 2 very strong chapters near you, where if you contact either the Maryland chapter or the DC area chapter, you can get help from their directors. There are some wonderful, wonderful directors, and I know they're very willing to visit clubs, especially clubs that are just getting off the ground like yours seems to be.
Yes, thank you for that. I really
Yeah,
appreciate that.
and
It,
one
Mark's
more.
going to add something too. Go on, Mark.
Yeah, one more follow-up to the question. I used to serve on that committee for a number of years, so I'm very familiar with it. Think of it as an investment club, picking stocks, although they are trying to pick stocks that are going to have, 10 years of history and, meet certain minimum requirements. But I would treat it no differently than the results of a screen. And we all know that, especially as a beginning investor, a screening result is just the start. You want to verify and understand your company and consider it one source to help with that process, but certainly not a final. It's not intended to be a final recommendation on a company. So do the homework, but yeah, it's a credible source. They are smart, wonderful people on that committee.
Also, I would
thank you.
chime in there that you study stocks of companies you know something about. Like if you shop at Costco, then look at that, and that's a good company to look at. So you know something about it, you shop there, you're there, and do something like that. So look at companies you know something about.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, I have a hand up from Keith. So I'm going to take Precious's hand down. And Keith, I can unmute you and go ahead and speak, Keith. Go on.
Good.
I subscribe to Morningstar. Is it reasonable to compare your results on pricing to what Morningstar has? I guess I'm asking, what do you think of Morningstar?
Well, I think Morningstar is a very credible source. The problem with Morningstar is that they don't give us a standard call on future earnings or future sales. Many times, if there's an analysis report within the Morningstar report, the analyst will call out what they think future sales will grow at or what they think future earnings will grow out. But there's not a standard place in the Morningstar data set where I can get a 5-year number or a 3-year number or whatever. I did point out that the data set that Better Investing uses, the data that comes right into your tool, many times, not always, but many times, you'll get a 2-year call on sales and a 5-year call on earnings. If that data is there, then absolutely use it to help make a decision. But the key to a good analysis is getting the opinion from a number of different sources. If your geography is such that you're near a large city, I would see if you can get Value Line from the library in that large city. I'm in Michigan, and I know that the Michigan Consortium, which is almost all the libraries in Michigan, have a Value Line subscription that I can get these reports free just by sitting in my living room with a library card and a library number that goes with that card. So I would search for Value Line. CFRA, that's the old S&P, is a really great source where I can get information many times. Going to the company website is a great place to get information. And don't forget that there are online sources many times that will make a 5-year earnings call or a 2 or 3 or 5-year sales call. So don't be afraid to use sources from online places like Zacks or like the NASDAQ source or anything like that. But as a beginner, don't overwhelm yourself with sources. In the beginning, 1 or 2 or 3 sources is great. You're trying to familiarize yourself with the tool. And as you get more experience, then expand your data source search so that you get opinions from a number of different things. Be careful that you're not looking at sources that are doing a different type of analysis. As better investors, we are not technical analysts. We don't believe in watching the price charts and predicting behavior from the price charts. So if you're looking at a technical site, those particular indicators are not things that we look at as beginners, at least. We might add them to what we think about as we become more experienced, but as a beginner, look for fundamental data about earnings, sales, profits, debt, things that we can actually measure and then evaluate. Any other questions in the back room? I don't have any other hands up. Any other questions?
I think we're pretty much all set.
Yeah, I think you're pretty well caught up, but you also might let everybody know when the next sessions are and how to register for them.
Yeah, if you haven't registered for session 2, that it's still open. You can go to manifestinvesting.com and register for class 2 if you're not already registered. You can also go to betterinvesting.org, look for under chapters, look for Mid-Michigan chapter. If you're already a member of our chapter, then it'll appear as your chapter, and you can register for class 2 right there. Class 2 is going to begin right at noon. That's about 37 minutes from now. We're going to take a moment to decompress for about 10 or 15 minutes, and then we'll be chatting with folks at about 1:45 again, opening up to answer questions, to take comments, and just to talk with the folks. That's the kind of thing that Mark and I and Herb love to do with the people that come to our classes. And it's the thing that Mark and I especially miss most of all. And that's just being able to especially talk to new investors like many of you. So with that, we're going to say good afternoon, and we'll be back at around 11:45 if you're taking class number 2. Anything else to add, Mark or Herb?
Nope. Thanks, everybody. See you in a few minutes.
Thank
Thank
you,
you.
folks.